Hi everybody, this is Clay from CDH Red Level. This rendition of 5 Minute Fridays, talking about kind of a recap of the last Nintex Users Group. We covered a lot of information in that, so if you want to see the whole recording of that, please look down in the description. URL to that presentation should be available down there for you to see the whole thing. There was a lot covered, so it's going to be kind of hard to go over a lot of it here in 5 minutes. It's a very technical, deep dive into the power of Nintex. Basically, everyone is very familiar with simple workflows in Nintex. A lot of the actions that you typically go through with Nintex. You have your standard approval workflows, which everyone is familiar with. I kind of highlight where it's not just for approvals. We can do much more with it. Everyone's familiar with flexi tasks and assigned to-do tasks, and always seeking out and reaching out to somebody for more information to approve or reject something. That's your most common scenario, and then routing documents and files from there. But you can get very detailed development-wise with Nintex as well. Some of the examples that I've gone through where I have taken XML and torn it apart and used it in some way, or calling out web services to get data from completely separate external systems. It's not always all about SharePoint. I went over in the webinar about some case studies that I had gone through, some real-world scenarios where we implemented some advanced features using Nintex. In this case, I was creating a new custom action that didn't exist in Nintex yet. And I'm not sure if everyone knew that you can do that. You can use Visual Studio, and Nintex has provided some workflow project templates for Visual Studio, and you can go and create a brand new action that never existed before. And in this case, what we had done for a client was we needed to copy a list item, and here's a view of the out-of-the-box copy item action, which allows you to copy from one library to another within the same site, and that's kind of where it ends. But what we needed was to be able to copy from one site collection to another site collection, complete, or in some cases you can go as far as, because you control the code in this case, copying from one completely different web app to another completely different web app. If you wanted to get even more advanced and bake in some client-side object model code on the server side, you can reach into a completely different farm if you needed to. Really the sky's the limit when you control the code. So in this case, we made a drop down of a list of site collections that were available on the system. In this case, just the one web application, but it could go much farther than that. And we created this action so that a client could use it in their workflows to copy a document from one document library in one site to a completely different site. And that worked out pretty well. One of the other case studies that we go over in the webinar in detail is a client needed to have a workflow that would log changes made to a list. They needed to see the values of each field that were changed before they were changed, what they were and what they are now. Now, standard SharePoint version history lets you see what the list is during that version, what the fields exist or what their values are on that version. But you can't really go back like with any reporting tools and look back in SharePoint version history on a list item or a document and see what they used to be. In this case, they were creating two lists. This was a financial institution that manages trusts. They had a trusts list, and the log is going to log everything that takes place in trust lists. So any fields that change, they change the title of a trust, they want to see the previous value and the old value, and then they can point some reporting tools at that. They can monitor it, they can keep it track of what changed over history without having to try and reach into SharePoint version history, which is pretty tough for a reporting tool to reach into. And that solution, of course, uses some user-defined actions. There's actually if we go back, this URL here, you can see this was where I kind of had a starting place for this. There's an user-defined action out there available in the Nintex community to do this very thing. There were a couple of things that I had to go through, some hurdles that I had to jump through to get it to work right, because it had kind of an inherent issue with it. It stores some of the metadata that it needs to use internal to the list, and then when you would ask the list for changes that were made. It would also report the changes made to that internal column that you're using to track. And every time you change it, there's this exponential addition of data unto itself. It's very hard to explain in 5 minutes. But I had to edit this workflow to hit the SharePoint web interface. This is the user find action. I'll kick ahead to this. This is all from that presentation, so there's a lot here that we're not going to go over. The get list items changed since token endpoint in the SharePoint API just gives you, here are all the values that these list items used to contain from the last time they were updated, and we're polling this in Nintex using these actions here. So I'm going and hitting the specifically, let me find it, the web service. So I'm calling a web service and reaching into the SharePoint backend at that point to pull those values from SharePoint, kind of like reaching into version history through the workflow, and then making those available and publishing them out to that trust log. Very complicated. You'll have to watch the webinar if you want to get greater detail of what was going on there. But you know, those are the highlights really from that workflow, or from that Nintex user group session. Some of the other things talked about, there were a lot of new features in Nintex. Jen Miller, our Nintex representative, went through a lot of good information there, so definitely check out that webinar to see. Kind of highlight one of my most anticipated changes that have been announced is governance on Nintex workflow. The ability to have someone assigned as the gatekeeper for publishing changes to your workflow. Not just, you know, anybody goes in, makes changes and publishes them and it's the Wild West. In this case, you know, you have a manager who's taking care of deployments of changes to that workflow. So everything has to get routed through them for approval before it is, you know, set into action. So really, that's about all we got time for. I'm gone over my 5 minutes now. I'm sure that there is a lot of information really in that webinar to check out if you want the full abridged version. All right, thanks, and we'll see you next Friday.